The concrete walls were 12 feet thick. The German commander had sent one message to the Canadians: "I do not negotiate. My men will fight to the last bullet. You may waste your soldiers trying to take this fortress, we will still be here. When you give up and leave." He was right. For 3 days, those walls had swallowed everything the Allies threw at them. 500 naval shells bounced off like pebbles. 80 men charged across open ground. 23 died in 90 seconds. Another assault threw smoke. 24 more fell. The wooden crosses kept multiplying in neat rows behind the Canadian trenches. 34 graves. 34 telegrams to families back home. The British admiral stood in his pristine uniform, pointing his walking stick at the fortress. "Bigger guns are coming," he declared with absolute certainty. "We'll pound them until the concrete cracks." The American general nodded. "Acceptable casualties. Send another wave with better support. More bombing, more bodies, more failure." But one man wasn't listening to the generals. Major Jack Morrison stood in the rain-soaked trench. Ignoring the argument about artillery, his eyes were fixed on something. The professional soldiers had completely overlooked a tide chart. Morrison had never planned to be a soldier. Before the war, he'd spent 15 years on fishing boats off Newfoundland, reading weather in the color of clouds, drilling precise holes in ice jams with dynamite, learning the most important lesson the ocean teaches: you don't fight the sea, you work with it. Now, staring at that impenetrable fortress, Morrison wasn't thinking like a soldier at all. He was thinking like a fisherman. And he was smiling. October 1944. Breskens Pocket, Netherlands North Sea wind cut across the flat. Dutch coastline, carrying salt spray and the acrid smell of cadite. 180 German soldiers sat behind those 12-foot walls, confident and untouchable. They had food for 6 weeks, ammunition stacked to the ceiling. 3 artillery pieces that could sink ships 15 miles away. More importantly, they controlled the Scheldt estuary, the gateway to Antwerp, Europe's second-largest port. Every day that fortress stood meant for 1,000 tons of Allied supplies sat useless in warehouses. Fuel, ammunition, medicine, everything the armies needed to push into Germany and end this war. The fortress had to fall. But how do you break 12 feet of reinforced concrete when shells just bounce off? Major Klaus Richter, the German commander, had answered that question in his reply to the Canadian surrender demand. His words, written in perfect English on expensive paper, were ice cold. Proper military doctrine says we continue the bombardment. The British admiral was saying now, 3 days into this disaster, heavier naval guns. Pound them until they break. But Morrison had stopped listening. His weathered fisherman's hands traced lines on the map spread across an ammunition crate. Not the fortress, not the German positions, the tide charts. The Scheldt had the second highest tides in Europe. 45 feet of difference between high and low tide, twice every single day. The fortress sat directly on top of the seawall, not behind it, right on top of it. Foundation at mean sea level. Drainage pumps designed for normal rainfall and normal tides. But what if the water wasn't normal? Morrison's finger traced the path water would take if the seawall was breached at The right spot, at the right time. His lips moved silently. Fish don't fight the current. They use it. Asterisk that afternoon, Morrison gathered his 6-man engineering team in a supply tent. Rain drummed on the canvas as he spread his calculations across stacked ammunition boxes. Here, his finger jabbed at a point 200 yards west of the fortress. British naval bombardment 3 weeks ago cracked this section of seawall. I've seen it through binoculars. It's our weak point. Lieutenant Davies leaned closer. What are you thinking, sir? We breached the wall here at low tide. The North Sea pours through. When high tide comes 6 hours later, millions of gallons flood the fortress basement. Their ammunition underwater, supplies ruined, 6 feet of seawater, with no way to pump it out fast enough. Sergeant Mackenzie whistled low. How much explosive? £400, placed deep in the cracks, shaped charges to direct the blast inward. We detonate at the exact moment of low tide when water pressure hits minimum. Morrison's eyes gleamed. The wall blows open and the sea does the rest. Where do we get £400 of explosives? Morrison's smile was pure mischief. We borrow it. £10 from this engineer company, 20 from that one. Nobody notices until after we're done. That night, Morrison and 5 engineers blackened their faces with mud and slipped into the freezing North Sea. The water felt like knives of ice. The tide was going out in 3 hours. It would hit its lowest point. They reached the sea wall and climbed onto exposed rocks slick with seaweed and sharp with barnacles. Morrison shielded his flashlight and examined the cracks. Better than he'd hoped. British shells had fractured the concrete deep into its structure. He could push his entire fist into some gaps, perfect for explosives. After 90 minutes of measurements and reconnaissance, they swam back. Morrison's whole body shook. From cold, his teeth chattering so hard he bit his tongue. But he had what he needed. The plan would work. Asterisk. The next morning, Morrison presented his flooding operation to Allied command in a farmhouse that reeked of wet wool and tobacco. The British admiral's face turned crimson. You want to flood a Dutch town? Absolutely unacceptable. We cannot destroy civilian property, sir. Morrison kept his voice calm. The Dutch government evacuated every civilian 2 weeks ago. The town is completely empty, already destroyed by artillery. We'd be flooding an abandoned battlefield, not anyone's home. The American general interrupted. What if this scheme fails? What if you blow the wall and water doesn't reach the fortress? Then what? Then we're in exactly the same position we're in now, sir. The fortress still stands. We try something different, but if it succeeds, we take that position without losing one more soldier. The admiral shook his head firmly. Madness. Proper military doctrine says we continue bombardment. Heavier naval guns. We pound them until they break. The American nodded. Another infantry assault with better artillery preparation. That's how wars are won. Superior firepower and determination. Morrison felt frustration building, but kept his face neutral. The proper way had already killed 34 of his friends. The proper way was failing, but he was only a major. These men were an admiral and a general. Then a voice cut through. From the doorway, I think the Major's plan is excellent. Everyone turned. Lieutenant General Guy Simons, commander of the entire 2nd Canadian Corps. Highest-ranking Canadian officer in the Netherlands walked in and fixed the British admiral. And American general with cold grey eyes. The British want to keep bombing, Simons said quietly. The Americans want to keep charging men across open ground. I want my soldiers to go home alive to their families. He turned to Morrison. Major, you have 24 hours. Use whatever resources you need. I'll handle anyone who objects. Morrison's team worked through the night, visiting 3 different Canadian engineer companies spread across 5 miles. £10 here, 15 there, 25 from another unit. The engineers who gave up their explosives asked no questions. Engineers helped each other. By dawn, £400 assembled in a barn. Now the tricky part. The charges had to stay completely dry, even underwater at the wall's base. Morrison wrapped each bundle in rubberized canvas tarps normally used to cover vehicles. Waterproof tape sealed every edge. He rigged the detonators using modified artillery fuses connected to a waterproof watch mechanism. If the primary failed, backup fuses would trigger automatically 15 minutes later. Nothing could be left to chance. For transport, Morrison contacted the Dutch resistance through Canadian intelligence. They provided a fishing boat with a quiet engine that wouldn't alert German sentries. Morrison checked the tide charts one final time. Low tide, exactly 3:47 a.m., October 28th. 20-minute window. 20 minutes to reach the wall. 20 minutes to place the £100 in the cracks. 20 minutes to wire all detonators correctly. 20 minutes to get back before the tide turned. Morrison looked at his watch, then at his 6 engineers. Grim faces, determined. They climbed into the fishing boat as the sun set over the cold grey North Sea. The engine rumbled quietly. Morrison steered toward darkness and the waiting sea wall. The fishing boat cut through black water in complete silence. Morrison stood at the wheel, steering by instinct and memory. No lights. Engine noise barely a whisper. The North Sea stretched around them like liquid darkness. Morrison checked his waterproof watch. 3:15 a.m. 32 minutes until low tide. 32 minutes until everything had to be perfect. The damaged seawall section appeared ahead, a darker shadow against night sky. Morrison guided the boat close. His engineers jumped onto slippery rocks, passing waterproofed explosive bundles hand to hand. Each man knew his job. They'd practiced 20 times on land. Now they executed in freezing darkness with numb fingers and racing hearts. Morrison climbed onto the wall and found the largest crack. He pushed a 40-pound bundle deep into the gap. Concrete edges scraped. His knuckles raw. He didn't notice. Lieutenant Davies worked 3 feet away, placing another charge. Sergeant Mackenzie wedged explosives into a vertical crack, running 8 feet down into the foundation. 18 minutes until low tide. Morrison connected detonator wires. With fingers barely able to feel, the waterproof watch mechanism ticked quietly. He set it for 3:47 exactly. 1 minute wrong, and everything fails. Too early water pressure to high. Too late rising tide already pushing back against the breach. Morrison's hands moved with the careful precision of 15 years tying fishing nets in storms. Mackenzie finished the last bundle. Thumbs up in darkness. 11 minutes. The engineers scrambled into the fishing boat. Morrison made one final check. Everything looked correct. He jumped in and pushed off. The quiet engine carried them 800 yards away to safety behind a rocky outcropping. They crouched and waited. Wind picked up, spray stinging their faces. The North Sea slapped against the hull. Morrison watched his watch. 5 minutes. 4. 3. His heart hammered. 2 minutes. 1. He whispered a prayer. At exactly 3:47 a.m. on October 28, 1944. 400 pounds of explosives detonated inside the seawall. The sound wasn't a sharp bang like artillery. It was a deep rumbling roar from inside the earth itself. Morrison felt the shockwave roll through water and shake the boat. The seawall erupted, a fountain of concrete chunks and white spray. Pieces flew 50 feet into the air, splashing down across 100 yards of ocean. When spray cleared, Morrison saw a gap 30 feet wide, where solid concrete had stood moments before. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then the North Sea realized there was an opening. It poured through with the force of an avalanche made of water. The sound was like Niagara Falls compressed into 30 feet of width. 50,000 gallons of seawater rushed through the breach every single minute. The flow created a current so strong that fish and debris spun in circles at the edges. Morrison watched the white wall of water surge across flat ground toward the fortress 200 yards away. The water spread and slowed as it crossed the distance. But it kept coming. The North Sea had found a new path. Nothing could stop it now. Morrison checked his watch again. High tide, 9:47 a.m. 6 hours from now. The fortress had 6 hours before the real flooding began. Morrison and his men returned to Canadian lines and reported success to General Simons. Then, Morrison positioned himself in an observation post with powerful binoculars. He had to see if his plan actually worked or if he just wasted 400 pounds of explosives on an elaborate failure. Hours passed slowly. Morrison watched water creeping across the battlefield. At first, just a thin sheet spreading over mud and rocks, then pooling in low spots. By 8 a.m., 1 foot deep across 100-yard area round the fortress. By 9 a.m., 2 feet deep and rising faster as the tide came in. Inside the fortress, Major Richter realized something was terribly wrong. Water was seeping up through floor drains in the basement. At first, his men tried pumping it out. The fortress drainage system was designed for 5,000 gallons per hour. But water was coming in at 50,000 gallons per minute. The pumps choked, sputtered, stopped working entirely. Richter ordered sandbags on interior doors to contain the water. But water pressure doesn't care about sandbags. It pushed through gaps and cracks with unstoppable force. At 9:30 a.m., seawater reached the main ammunition storage room. 18 feet of water filled it in 20 minutes. Artillery shells floated, then sank. Salt water poured into wooden crates and cardboard boxes. Every explosive, every bullet, useless, even if they could dry them later. Salt water had already ruined the gunpowder. The fortress had just lost all ammunition reserves. Richter tried radioing for help, but the radio room was flooding. Equipment sparked and died. His final transmission cut off mid-sentence. The Canadians have weaponized the sea itself. We are being drowned in our own fortress. This is not warfare. This is silence. Morrison listened to the recording later. He heard the panic in Richter's voice. Asterisk at 9:47 a.m. High tide arrived. The water level jumped dramatically. Morrison watched through binoculars as the fortress disappeared behind a sheet of spray and waves. When visibility cleared, water surrounded the entire structure. It poured through main entrance doors, flooded through ventilation shafts, rose up outside walls like the fortress was sinking into the ocean. Inside, German soldiers abandoned lower levels and climbed stairs, but water kept rising. 6 feet deep in some corridors, 4 feet in the command room. At 10:15 a.m., Morrison saw movement on the fortress roof. German soldiers were climbing out through a rooftop hatch. They stood on wet concrete, looking down at water covering their fortress. More soldiers appeared. Then more. Within 5 minutes, 80 German soldiers on the roof. At 10:30 a.m., a white flag appeared, a bedsheet tied to a broken radio antenna. The white fabric snapped and fluttered in the wind. Morrison felt relief flood through his entire body. It had worked. The plan had actually worked. At 10:45 a.m., the main fortress door opened. German soldiers began wading out through chest-deep water, hands raised above their heads, uniforms soaked, faces showing shock and confusion. They'd expected to fight bullets and bombs. Instead, they'd been defeated by the ocean itself. 180 German soldiers surrendered in groups of 10 and 20. They waded through water toward Canadian lines. Some were crying, some looked angry. Most just looked exhausted and beaten. Major Klaus Richter emerged last at 11 a.m., still wearing his officer's cap. Water dripped from his uniform. He carried nothing except his dignity. A Canadian officer met him and accepted his formal surrender. Richter looked back at his fortress sitting in 6 feet of seawater. His voice was quiet when he spoke in English. You did not fight us with guns. You fought us with the sea. I have been a soldier for 20 years. I have never seen anything like this. The Canadian officer nodded. War changes, sir. We adapt or we die. Richter handed over his pistol and became a prisoner of war. Morrison stood in the observation post and watched the last Germans surrender. Not one Canadian soldier had died in this operation. Not one. Military analysts later estimated a frontal assault would have cost 200 to 300 Canadian casualties. The actual cost, 400 pounds of explosives and 1 breached seawall. The Scheldt estuary was now open to Allied shipping. Within 72 hours, the first supply ships reached Antwerp. 4,000 tons of supplies every single day began flowing to Allied armies. The war would continue for 7 more months, but this moment marked a turning point. And it had been won not with superior firepower, but with superior thinking. Morrison had thought like a fisherman, not a soldier. That made all the difference. The revolution within 1 week Every Canadian engineer unit requested copies of Morrison's plans. They wanted the exact mathematics. How much explosive for different wall thicknesses, how to calculate tidal flows, how to time detonations for maximum effect. Morrison sat in a farmhouse for 3 days straight, writing detailed reports, diagrams showing charge placement in wall cracks, instructions on reading tide charts and calculating water volumes, techniques for waterproofing explosives and building reliable timers. Every page was copied and distributed to allied engineering units across Europe. By December 1944, British commandos used a similar flooding technique against German bunkers on the French coast. They breached a river levee at low water and flooded 3 enemy positions simultaneously. The Germans surrendered without firing a shot. In January 1945, Soviet engineers in Poland used controlled river flooding to force Germans out of fortified towns along the Vistula River. The tactic spread because it worked, because it saved lives on both sides. Military planners began teaching environmental warfare in engineering schools. Use the terrain. Use the weather. Use the water. Don't fight nature. Make nature fight for you. Lieutenant General Simons promoted Morrison to Lieutenant Colonel 2 weeks after Breskens. Morrison took command of an entire Canadian engineer brigade and led them through the Netherlands into Germany during the war's final months. His reputation grew. Other officers called him the fisherman because he always found ways to use water and terrain to solve problems that bullets couldn't solve. When the war ended in May 1945, Morrison had been awarded the Distinguished Service Order and mentioned in dispatches 3 times. He was 30 years old and tired to his bones. 2 men, 2 lives. Morrison returned to Newfoundland in August 1946. He stepped off the ship onto familiar docks and breathed salt air that smelled like home. The war felt like a dream already fading. He went back to fishing for 2 years, but the ocean had changed for him. He'd seen too much, used too much. The water no longer felt peaceful. In 1948, Morrison became harbour master for his home port. He managed boat traffic, tide schedules, and repairs. He started a small fishing fleet company. By 1960, he owned 12 boats and employed 40 men. Morrison never spoke about the war unless someone asked directly. Even then, his answers were short. What he did during the war was private. The memories belonged to him and to the men who'd been there. Morrison lived quietly for 43 years after the war ended, married in 1949. 3 children, watched them grow up and have children of their own. He died in 1989 at age 74 from a heart attack while working on his boat. The people of Newfoundland remembered him as a good harbour master and a fair businessman. In 1991, the provincial government named a new bridge after him, the Morrison Bridge, connecting the mainland to a small fishing island. Most people who drove across that bridge never knew why it had that name. They didn't know about the fortress or the seawall or the 180 Germans who surrendered to seawater. Major Klaus Richter spent nearly 2 years as a prisoner of war in a Canadian camp. The Canadians treated him well. Bed, food, Medical care. In June 1946, Richter returned to Germany and found his home city of Hamburg destroyed by Allied bombing. 70% rubble. His family home gone. His wife killed in the bombing. His children sent to live with relatives in the countryside. Richter was 46 years old, and his entire world had been erased. The new German government wouldn't allow former Wehrmacht officers to serve in any military capacity. Richter became a school teacher instead. He taught history and geography to children who'd grown up during the war. He never talked about his military service, but in 1962, at age 62, Richter wrote a memoir called Fortress of Water. The book described his experience at Breskens. The moment he realized the Canadians were flooding his position, the fear of drowning in his own fortress, the shame of surrender, and the relief of survival. The book's final chapter acknowledged Morrison's tactic as militarily brilliant and morally sound. Richter wrote that Morrison had defeated him without massacre. That distinction mattered. The meeting in 1978. Richter traveled to Newfoundland. He was 78 years old and wanted to meet the man who'd flooded him out. 34 years earlier, Richter found Morrison working on a fishing boat in the harbour. The two men looked at each other for a long moment. Then Morrison invited Richter aboard his boat. They spent the afternoon on the water, not saying much. They watched the tides come in and go out, felt the wind, smelled the salt air. When they returned to shore, Richter shook Morrison's hand and said something Morrison never forgot. "You understood the ocean better than I understood concrete." Morrison smiled and replied that concrete was just concrete. But the ocean was alive. They parted as old men who'd once been enemies and were now just two people who understood the sea. Richter died 3 years later in 1981 at age 81. The lessons from the Breskens flooding operation spread far beyond military circles. The story taught 3 important truths about solving impossible problems. First, use your environment as an ally instead of an obstacle. Morrison didn't see the ocean as something in his way. He saw it as a weapon more powerful than any gun. Professional soldiers thought like soldiers. Morrison thought like a fisherman. That different perspective changed everything. Second, winning without killing is still winning. Morrison saved Canadian lives by not sending them to die in frontal assaults. He also saved German lives by giving them a choice to surrender instead of fight to the death. 180 German soldiers went home after the war because Morrison chose water over bullets. Third, questioning authority can save lives. The British admiral wanted more bombing. The American general wanted more infantry charges. Morrison questioned whether their way was the only way. His willingness to challenge conventional thinking led to a breakthrough that saved hundreds of lives. Modern militaries still study Morrison's operation in engineering schools and staff colleges. The principles he demonstrated remain relevant. During conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, coalition forces used controlled flooding to force enemies out of fortified positions. In urban combat, engineers redirected water from damaged pipes and canals to flood basement bunkers. The technology has advanced, but the basic idea stays the same. Use the environment. Use physics. Use nature's power instead of fighting against it. In the current war in Ukraine, both sides use dam controls and river flooding as tactical weapons. Every time military engineers breach a dam or redirect a river, they're using tactics that trace back to a Newfoundland fisherman standing in Dutch rain, staring at tide charts. Morrison gave only one interview about the Breskens operation. In 1987, 2 years before his death, a military historian visited him in Newfoundland. Morrison was 72 years old. The historian asked him to explain his thinking. Morrison sat on his porch overlooking the harbour and spoke slowly. "I was a fisherman before I was a soldier. Fishermen learn early that you don't fight the ocean. The ocean is too big and too strong. You learn to work with its power instead. You use the tides. You use the currents. You let the water carry you where you want to go. The sea doesn't care about human wars. It just moves according to the moon and the wind. We didn't fight the Germans with the ocean. We just asked the ocean to move at the right time in the right direction. After that, gravity and water pressure did all the work. We just had to get out of the way and let nature be nature." That understanding captures the deepest meaning of Morrison's achievement. The most human response to violence is not always more violence. Sometimes the answer is understanding forces bigger than human conflict. Water and tides and gravity don't care about politics, or nationalism or military doctrine. They just follow natural laws. Morrison understood those laws better than he understood military tactics, and that knowledge saved lives on both sides of a terrible war. The Breskens fortress fell not because Canadians were stronger or braver than Germans. It fell because one man looked at an impossible problem and asked a different kind of question. Not how do we break through concrete, but how do we make concrete irrelevant? The answer was always there in the tide charts and the North Sea. Morrison just had to see it.